My name is Duncan Work, and I'm one of the organizers of this event. So Stephen Druker is a public interest attorney who founded the Alliance for Biointegrity, and as its executive director initiated a lawsuit that forced the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to divulge its files on genetically engineered foods. This revealed that politically influenced administrators had covered up the extensive warnings of their own scientists about the abnormal risks, misrepresented the facts, and then allowed these novel products onto the market without requiring the testing that's mandated by federal food safety law. He is a prominent commentator on the risk of GE foods, genetically engineered foods, and has served on the food safety panels at conferences conducted by the National Research Council and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. He has been invited to speak at many universities, including Harvard, Columbia, Cornell, and the University of Copenhagen. Stephen Druker has met with government officials worldwide, including the UK's Environmental Minister, Canada's Health Minister, and the heads of food safety for the UK, France, Ireland, and Australia. He was also invited to confer at the White House executive offices with an interagency task force of President Clinton's Council on Environmental Quality. In June of this year, he received a Luxembourg Peace Prize for outstanding work on behalf of the environment. His influential book, Altered Genes, Tested Truth, How the Venture to Genetically Engineer Our Food has subverted science, corrupted government, and systematically deceived the public. That book was released on March 2015 with a foreword by Jane Goodall, hailing it as, without doubt, one of the most important books of the last 50 years. The talk he will present this evening is titled, How the Health Risks of GMOs Have Been Systematically Misrepresented, an assessment from the perspectives of both biological science and computer science. So now I'll ask Steve to come and do his talk.
All right.
Thank you very much. You know, since we're in a church this evening, I'd like to begin with a miracle. But since I'm not at the level where I can instantly manifest them yet, I'd like instead for you to envision a miraculous situation. So please imagine that at the snap of my fingers, there's an instantaneous wave of illumination through which every person on earth becomes instantly aware of all of the facts about genetically engineered foods. And everybody's opinion becomes fully aligned with our best scientific knowledge. Now, what do you think would happen in such a situation? Well, if we adhere to the routine rhetoric of the proponents of these products, we would have to predict that such a worldwide wave of enlightenment would cause all opposition to them to vanish. Because in the rendition of reality that they propound, all of the opposition to GMOs is based on ignorance, on people who just don't understand the facts, who are really way out of line with the science. But in the real world, in this actual planet we inhabit, the phenomenon that would quickly vanish is not the opposition to the foods, but the foods themselves. That's right, if everybody knew the actual facts about genetic engineering and the foods it has been producing, the entire venture that has been producing them would quickly collapse. And that is why, despite their pretensions about wanting to educate the public about the facts, the proponents have routinely misrepresented the facts. They have suppressed evidence that is uncomfortable, and when they haven't been able to suppress it, then they have done their best to distort it. And they've done a very good job about it, so that the opinions of even most scientists today about genetically engineered foods are significantly based on misinformation. Now, my book documents case after case in which eminent, and by the way, this is an important point, the main misrepresentations, the most serious ones, have not been coming from Monsanto and DuPont and the other major corporations that are producing these foods. The most insidious misrepresentations have come from eminent scientists and scientific organizations. My book documents case after case in which scientists and scientific institutions have stooped to deception in order to enable the GE food venture to advance. Basic facts of biology have been twisted. The process of creating genetically engineered foods has been deceptively described to make it appear far less disruptive and far more precise than it actually is. And false statements have consistently been issued about the tests on these foods to cover up troubling results. Further, the evidence that demonstrates the distortion of the evidence is solid, and its solidity has been attested by many experts. For instance, John Eichert, a professor emeritus of agricultural economics at the University of Missouri, has stated that the evidence presented in my book is, quote, comprehensive and irrefutable. And the molecular biologist David Schubert, a professor at the Salk Institute of Biological Studies in La Jolla, California, has hailed the book as scientifically solid and truly outstanding. He also stated that the book dispels the cloud of misinformation that has misled people into believing that GE foods have been adequately tested and don't entail abnormal risk. Moreover, the irrefutable fact that the facts have been routinely misrepresented is in itself concrete evidence, evidence of how strongly the evidence weighs against the soundness of the GE food venture. Because if the evidence were truly supportive of the venture's safety, there would have been no need to distort it. I think that's a no-brainer. If the facts are on your side, you're proud of them. You just speak them out. You don't have to adulterate them. It's only when the facts consistently go against your position that you have to resort to some sort of trickery. And the more people resort to trickery, the greater is the evidence, the greater is the implication that the facts go against them. Now, during the next 40 minutes, I'll point out some of the key distortions and falsehoods and clear up the confusion they've created. In the process, it will become evident that there are strong science-based reasons for reaching 4 major conclusions. Producing new foods through recombinant DNA technology, genetic engineering, is an inherently risky process. 2, every genetically engineered food poses an abnormal level of risk. 3, the safety of those on the market has never been adequately established. And 4, some of them have already been shown to be harmful. I will also explain how the GE food venture is not only abnormally risky from the standpoint of biological science, but is outright reckless when assessed from the perspective of computer science, and how the biotechnicians have utterly disregarded, and I'm not exaggerating, you will see they have utterly disregarded the hard-learned lessons that computer science has gained about the inherent risks of altering complex information systems. Well, let's first examine one of the biggest falsehoods that's been perpetrated in defense of GE foods. The routine assertion that there's an overwhelming scientific consensus they are safe, and that this consensus is based on solid scientific evidence. Indeed, the strength of this purported consensus is claimed to be on a par with the degree of expert consensus about the reality of human-induced climate change. However, although there truly is a genuine expert consensus in the case of climate change, there has never been one in regard to GE foods. And whereas every group of experts that has examined the data related to climate change has reached a common conclusion, many well-credentialed experts have raised cautions about GE foods, and several respected scientific institutions have done so as well. For instance, in 2001, the Royal Society of Canada, that nation's Academy of Science, issued a report concluding A, that the default prediction for each genetically engineered food should be that the genetic alteration has induced unintended and potentially harmful side effects, and B, that it is scientifically unjustifiable, those were their words, scientifically unjustifiable to regard any GE food as safe unless its safety has been established through a course of testing far more rigorous than any regulators have yet required. Now, it's important to note that that report has never been revised, nor has it ever been refuted, and it is as relevant today as when it was first issued. The British Medical Association and the editors of The Lancet, which is a premier medical journal, have also expressed concerns about the risks, and the Public Health Association of Australia has recently called for a complete moratorium on the planting and marketing of genetically engineered foods. Also, recently, more than 300 scientists have signed a statement that there is not a consensus within the scientific community about the safety of genetically engineered foods, and that more testing is needed. Now, the scientific experts at the US Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, have likewise recognized that GE foods entail abnormal risks. This fact came to light in 1998 when my organization, the Alliance for Biointegrity, led a lawsuit that compelled the FDA to hand over more than 44,000 pages of its internal files on GE foods. Within that trove of documents were a number of memos from the agency's own scientists expressing concerns about the unusual risks of genetic engineering, of the genetic engineering process, and the need for all the foods it produces to go through rigorous testing to make sure that there have not been unintended side effects, the same kinds of unintended side effects that the Canadian experts warned about. Now, the pervasiveness of the concerns within the agency scientific staff is attested by an FDA official who studied the expert input and declared, quote, "The processes of genetic engineering and traditional breeding are different, and according to the technical experts in the agency, they lead to different risks." Moreover, the FDA's biotechnology coordinator acknowledged there was not a consensus about safety in the scientific community outside the FDA either. However, the FDA has an admitted agenda to foster biotechnology. And when it issued its policy in May of 1992, it decided to foster biotechnology at the expense of the truth, science, and the law. The agency claimed that it was not aware of any information showing that foods derived by genetic engineering differ from other foods in any meaningful or uniform way. That's an outright lie. Their files are loaded with information from their own scientists, and they were aware of other information as well. The agency also asserted there was an overwhelming consensus among scientists that GE foods are so safe they don't require any testing, even though it knew full well that no such consensus existed. Accordingly, the FDA has allowed GE foods to enter the market here in the United States without requiring one smidgen of testing. That's right, they do not require one smidgen of testing, although they try to make a show in public that they do. That's all show. When it comes down to it, they had to admit they don't require any, and they don't. It's very clear from the record of what they do and don't do. In fact, they don't even require, the FDA does not even require that a manufacturer give it advance notice or even post notice that it has dumped a GMO on our market. So the FDA actually has acknowledged at one point that it really doesn't know for sure all the genetically engineered foods that are on our market because it doesn't require notification of those that have been put there. Now, if the FDA had told the truth and disclosed the extensive concerns of its own experts, the subsequent history of the GE venture would have been quite different, and most likely much shorter. At the very least, any GE foods that did reach the market would have been subjected to much more rigorous testing than regulators anywhere have required. Now, what about the oft-repeated claim that no ingestible product of genetic engineering has ever been linked to a human health problem? Well, that's also starkly at odds with reality. In fact, the technology's very first ingestible product not only caused a problem, it caused a major epidemic. Dozens of Americans were killed, thousands were seriously sickened. By the most recent estimate of the Center for Disease Control, between 4,000 and 5,000 Americans were seriously sickened by that first ingestible product of genetic engineering. Now, that product was a food supplement of the essential amino acid L-tryptophan that had been derived from genetically altered bacteria. Now, although it met standards for pharmacological purity, it was pharmacologically pure. Like all other tryptophan supplements, it contained minute amounts of impurities, and they were really minute. So minute that in the average case, they wouldn't have caused any problems. But unlike the conventionally produced supplements, one or more of the accidental additions of this supplement were highly toxic at extremely low levels. And because none of the tryptophan supplements produced via non-engineered bacteria had ever been linked to disease, and because genetic engineering can create unintended disruptions within the altered organisms, there were legitimate reasons to suspect that the genetic engineering process had induced the formation of the extraordinarily toxic substance or substances that had caused the calamity. Consequently, the proponents of genetic engineering strove to convince the public that the technology was blameless. So the proponents of genetic engineering, as we've seen tonight, strive to cover up the facts and to convince the public that genetic engineering has been absolved. But in order to do so, they have had to issue a string of inaccurate or downright false statements. Consequently, because those deceptions have been so successful, despite the fact the evidence points to genetic engineering as the most likely cause of the toxic contamination, most people who know of this tragedy are under the illusion that the technology has been exonerated. Worse, because GE proponents routinely claim that none of its products has ever been linked to a health problem. Most people aren't even aware that such a catastrophe happened. I've talked to many public health professionals who were shocked when I told them that a product of genetic engineering caused a major epidemic. They weren't even aware of that, and they're public health professionals. So that is how successful this campaign has been. That's why that chapter of my book that discusses it is titled Disappearing a Disaster, how the facts about a deadly epidemic caused by a product of genetic engineering have been consistently clouded. Now, it's important to note that the toxic tryptophan incident has serious implications for all foods produced through genetic engineering. Those bacteria had not been altered with foreign genes. Rather, they had merely been endowed with extra copies of some of their own genes. And they were not engineered to produce anything other than a beneficial substance they ordinarily make. But the forced overproduction of this normally benign substance apparently put abnormal stress on these organisms that led to the creation of an unintended and highly toxic byproduct. Now, remember I said apparently, okay? We have no conclusive proof, but the evidence points to that. Now, almost every genetically engineered food-yielding organism is being compelled to overproduce one or another chemical, and for that reason alone, each poses an unusual risk. It's additionally important to keep in mind that the lethal tryptophan supplements had passed through a filtration process, and yet were toxic, and that they were toxic, while genetically engineered fruits, grains, and vegetables do not undergo filtration. Now let's look at another standard claim. The claim that the safety of genetically engineered foods has been thoroughly established by reliable testing. Now it cannot survive scrutiny either, especially considering that many well-conducted studies published in peer-reviewed journals have detected harm to the animals that consumed genetically engineered food. In fact, in 2009, a systematic review of the toxicological studies on GE foods that was itself published in a peer-reviewed journal concluded that the results of most of them indicate that the products, quote, may cause hepatic, pancreatic, renal, and reproductive effects, and may alter hematological, biochemical, and immunologic parameters, the significance of which remains unknown, unquote. Another review that encompassed the additional studies that had been published up until August 2010 also provided cause for caution. It concluded there was an equilibrium between the research groups suggesting that GE crops are as safe as their non-GE counterparts and those raising still serious concerns. So obviously, the fact that more than 15 years after GE foods entered the market, half the published studies on them raised serious concerns in the eyes of objective scientific reviewers undermines the claim that their safety has been decisively established. And this conclusion is fortified when we examine some of the specific results that accrued both before and after that date. For instance, a team of university scientists published a paper in 2011 in which they reviewed the data from 19 of the feeding studies on genetically engineered soy and corn varieties that had already gone through the regulatory process. They had already gone through regulation, and they comprised 83% of the GE foods that people were regularly eating at that point, had been for years, and are still regularly eating. And what they found was disturbing. They found that 9% of the measured parameters, including blood and urine biochemistry and organ weights, were significantly disrupted in the animals that had eaten the GE feed. Moreover, the greatest disturbances were to the kidneys of the males and the livers of the females. And the scientists emphasized that because livers and kidneys are the major reactive organs in cases of chronic food toxicity, these results should have been viewed as danger signs, something the regulators had not seen fit to do. Furthermore, when the negative results are so disturbing that they cannot be ignored, they're vehemently and unjustly attacked, and the research is routinely misrepresented. A prominent role in this misinformation campaign has been played by the UK's Royal Society, the world's oldest and most respected scientific institution. For example, the Society recently declared that no research has indicated that the genetic engineering process itself has caused any harm, and that all the problems have been attributed either to the specific gene introduced or to particular agricultural practices. But this assertion is flat out false. For one thing, there have been very, very few studies in which the researchers even tried to point out a specific agricultural practice or a specific gene or protein that they felt was at fault for whatever problem that they identified, that they detected in the research. They didn't know. There was no way to tell what had caused the problem, whether it was the specific product of the gene that had been inserted, or it was some unintended byproduct, whether it was an herbicide that had been sprayed on the crop because the crop was engineered to be resistant to the herbicide. They were silent about it. So the genetic engineering process was not absolved at all by that research because they made no claims about it. And it's interesting that there actually was one very strongly well-conducted study that was published in The Lancet that actually did conclude that the genetic engineering process itself was likely, some general aspect of the process was likely to blame for the damage that was detected to the laboratory animals that had eaten the genetically engineered crop. And that's because the foreign protein that was produced by the gene that was introduced was known to be safe for mammals, even at very, very high levels of consumption, much higher than had been introduced by the genetic engineering. And the control potatoes have been spiked with the same level of that protein that was being produced in the genetically engineered potatoes. So they did that so that any problems could have been pinpointed to something else, some aspect of the genetic engineering process. It's interesting that the Royal Society has attacked that study very unjustly. My book, there's several pages in the book about the unjustness, but also you don't need to read the book to see that. I've recently published an article in Independent Science News on the website of Independent Science News, and you can go there and just look for my name and Royal Society. It analyzes the most recent report of the Royal Society that came out in 2016, in which that statement was made, and shows how it is actually replete with many misrepresentations, and shows how the Society has unjustly attacked that research. Now, it is only through the systematic misrepresentation of the facts by respected institutions and individuals and their willingness to disregard the ominous implications of the evidence that the GE food venture has been able to continue. And this disgraceful activity is being carried out in the name of science when it is actually subverting the precious principles of science. The extent to which the GE food venture has failed to be evidence-based and instead has rested on the denial and the disregard of the evidence has been vividly summarized by Dr. Michael Antonio, a molecular geneticist at King's College London School of Medicine. Now, I want to mention before reading this quote from Dr. Antonio that he is not opposed to genetic engineering in general. In fact, he employs genetic engineering in his own research. He and his team are endeavoring to understand human genetic disease, and they need to, at times, use genetic engineering in their research, and they're endeavoring to develop cures, and genetic engineering is within the range of cures that they are contemplating. So he's not against genetic engineering in general. However, he knows enough and he's studied enough research to think that genetic engineering in producing foods is not a good idea. And here is one of the statements he has made. If the kind of detrimental effects seen in animals fed GE food were observed in a clinical setting, the product's use would be halted and further research instigated to determine the cause and to find solutions. However, what repeatedly happens in the case of GE food is that despite increasing evidence of serious adverse health test results, government and industry continue unabated with the development, endorsement, and marketing of these foods as if nothing has happened, to the point they even seem to ignore the results of their own research. So even this short summary has revealed that from the standpoint of biological science, the GE food venture is significantly unsound. And when it's analyzed from the standpoint of computer science, the picture becomes even more troubling. Now, you may be wondering, well, what does that have to do with it? Why is that relevant? Well, it's highly relevant because both genetic engineering and computer science are engaged in altering complex information systems. And computer science has learned a lot about the risks of making such alterations. Moreover, it has learned that these risks are inescapable. That's not an exaggeration. Computer science has learned that the risk of altering complex information systems is inescapable, even when human beings have designed the systems. Software engineers have learned that when the information systems they themselves create become large and complex, there's no way to alter them with complete precision. Even when the alteration is a small refinement designed to improve the system's performance, the mere process of revising it in such an ostensibly minuscule manner is likely to disrupt one or more of its other components. This is an amazing phenomenon. Software systems are designed to be linear, which means they're structured so that a specific operation only produces a specific result. Operation X should only produce Y. However, despite the programmer's best efforts, their systems transcend the intended limits and, to a significant degree, behave in a non-linear manner. There's a very high likelihood that some of the parts will interact in ways that were not planned and cannot be predicted, which means that Operation X will not only yield Y, but might also generate Q and Z. Consequently, to reduce the potential for unintended interactions, software designers separate components that shouldn't interact and try to insulate them from such interaction. What they try to avoid is creating code that resembles this. They want to avoid writing what they call spaghetti code, and they really call it that. They call it spaghetti code. And spaghetti code is a program in which the components are complexly interconnected, like strands of spaghetti in a mound on a plate. It's hard to even see where one is going, and if you try to pull on one, operate on one, the others start slithering around too. So that's why they call complexly interrelated code spaghetti code. They want to avoid that. What they instead aim to create is what they call ravioli code. They try to design systems in which the components that aren't supposed to interact are as independent from one another as the portion of cheese and vegetables in these separate packets of pasta on a plate of ravioli. Even though programmers have succeeded in designing systems that are far more analogous to a plate of ravioli than a mound of spaghetti, and have reduced the potential for unintended interactions, they have not been able to eliminate it. Such unwanted results continue to occur. Let's compare the characteristics of human-designed information systems with those of bioinformation systems. Let's compare man-made software with nature's software. As I noted, human-made systems are designed to be linear, and although they unavoidably become nonlinear to some degree, they do for the most part function as linear systems. Otherwise, we couldn't use our computers at all. But the situation is very different in the case of bioinformation systems. They are inherently nonlinear. The various parts are intricately interconnected, and every action can create a wide range of effects, many of which cannot be predicted. So just to summarize, human-designed information systems, they're designed to be linear. They function in a largely linear manner. Bioinformation systems, inherently nonlinear, and they function in a highly nonlinear manner. Now, in their endeavor to maximize manageability, software engineers avoid creating spaghetti code. But bioinformation systems are the most extreme instances of spaghetti code. And even if a human being had been able to create them, he or she could not adequately comprehend their various interactions. So, on the left side, spaghetti code avoided, minimization of interaction between different components, bioinformation systems, the ultimate spaghetti code. By the way, computer scientists have stated this, I'm not making that up, unfathomable degree of interaction between the parts. Moreover, despite the substantial knowledge that we humans have gained about the workings of bioinformation systems, the extent to which our understanding remains deficient should be profoundly humbling. In human-designed systems, the rules governing how the parts interact are clearly expressed in written form, but only a small fraction of the rules of bioinformation systems are known, and most of those pertain to the mechanics of gene expression. Yet, as numerous experts have emphasized, many of the most important rules do not operate at the level of the genes. For instance, Richard Stroman, who was a distinguished professor of cell biology at the University of California, Berkeley, asserted that the most important rules operate at a higher level, the level at which genes are organized into what he called functional arrays. As he noted, at this level of gene management is not confined within the DNA, but is coextensive with the cell itself. Moreover, he emphasized that the dynamics operating at this level are different than those at the lower ones, and that the interactions are far more complex to the extent that they are ultimately transcalculational, which, as he noted, is a mathematical term for mind-boggling. Several other experts have also pointed out that bioinformation systems transcend DNA and ultimately extend throughout the entire organism, while also extending far beyond our comprehension. So, human-designed information systems are mind-made. Bioinformation systems are mind-boggling. Okay, the mind-made ones, the system's rules and dynamics are comprehended by those who make revisions. In the bioinformation systems, those who make the revisions do not understand them fully. The systems are transcalculation. The revisions are made with scant comprehension in comparison to the knowledge with which human-designed systems are altered. So in light of these enormous differences, it would be reasonable to think that genetic engineers should exercise far greater caution than do software engineers, but in reality they exercise far less. Software engineers recognize the inescapable risks of altering complex information systems, and they deal with them responsibly. Accordingly, when they revise programs, they routinely conduct tests to detect whether any problems have been created. Moreover, there's a special class of software for which the testing is extremely rigorous. It's called life-critical software, software that can cause loss of life if it malfunctions. Examples are the programs that govern pacemakers and X-ray machines and the ones that serve as airplane guidance systems. In the US and the EU, not only are such programs required to undergo strict testing before they're allowed on the market, they also must be rigorously tested any time they're revised, no matter how minor the revision. The regulators will not accept arguments that the revised program is substantially equivalent to the former version. Instead, there must be a demonstration of safety achieved via systematic, stringent testing. But there's a glaring contrast in how risks are handled when disruptive alterations are made to the biggest, most complex, and least understood information systems on our planet. The biotechnicians do not adequately acknowledge the risks, and in fact, they largely deny them. Even the regulators have discounted the risks and assumed there's little need for rigorous testing. As I stated before, the US Food and Drug Administration claims that GE foods are so safe they don't need to be tested at all. And although regulators in the European Union and most other countries do require some kind of testing, it's minimal. For almost 20 years, GE foods were allowed on worldwide markets based solely on some superficial showing of substantial equivalence to their conventional counterparts, something that is never allowed in the case of life-critical software, despite the fact that a toxic tomato could cause far more deaths than a malfunctioning X-ray machine. And although the European Union has finally required safety testing with the whole food, the tests are still remarkably lax by software standards. Even if GE Foods were compelled to undergo the same testing that's mandated for new pharmaceutical drugs, it would still fall short of the level of rigor that's required when changes are made to life-critical software programs. As my book demonstrates, if the kind of rigor that's required in software testing were mandated for GE Foods, the entire venture would implode. It could not economically bear that level of testing. Consequently, the whole venture is incurably risky. Now, you might be wondering how the people promoting genetic engineering could remain so oblivious to the risks of altering complex information systems. Well, a big part of that answer is quite simple. They initially failed to appreciate that they were actually dealing with intricate, highly coordinated information systems. And this constricted outlook persisted for a long time and significantly colored all their subsequent thinking. As strange as it may seem, in light of our current knowledge about the genome, when the genetic engineering venture first began, its practitioners presumed that genes act independently, that they're not arranged in an organized manner, and that the sequence in which they occur is essentially irrelevant. Accordingly, They also presume that the genome is a simple linear system in which the action of a single gene will not significantly impact the others and won't disrupt their normal function. For instance, in a New York Times article, the veteran technology reporter Denise Caruso observed, the presumption that genes operate independently has been institutionalized since 1976, when the first biotech company was founded. In fact, it is the economic and regulatory foundation on which the entire biotechnology industry is built. This set of assumptions supported the belief that a chunk of recombinant DNA could be wedged into a plant's genome without inducing disturbance, because if the behavior of the native genes was largely uncoordinated and their arrangement was irrelevant, there would be no important patterns that could be perturbed. Accordingly, they engendered confidence in the precision of genetic engineering by implying that its results would be consistently predictable. However, these influential assumptions, which provided the ideological foundation for a colossal venture to transform agriculture, have been decisively discredited. Abundant evidence has demonstrated that there is a high degree of coordination between genes and that their arrangement is highly organized. And this evidence undermines the claims about the safety of genetic engineering. Thus, in her previously mentioned New York Times article, Denise Caruso asserted, evidence of a networked genome shatters the scientific basis for virtually every official risk assessment of today's commercial biotech products, from genetically engineered crops to pharmaceuticals. Now, it's important to emphasize that Caruso's comments were made without even taking the evidence from computer science into consideration. So when that powerful body of knowledge is additionally taken into account, it's clear that the GE food venture is not only seriously unsound, but outright reckless. Of course, new modes of manipulating genomes, such as CRISPR-Cas9, are being introduced that are promoted as being precise forms of gene editing. And it's claimed that they're going to provide safe ways of creating new foods, that they shouldn't need to be tested at all, shouldn't need to be labeled. Is this legitimate? No, not from the standpoint of computer science it isn't. For instance, these techniques can still induce accidental off-target effects. And as is the case with previous modes of genetic engineering, in order to transform the altered plant cells into mature seed-bearing plants, tissue culture must be employed. And tissue culture is a significantly artificial and mutagenic procedure that imparts what scientists have termed a genomic shock. So even if all of the off-target effects of the so-called editing are completely eliminated, which many scientists think will never be able to be done, but even if it could be, they don't have fertile seeds. They have cells taken from adult plants that they have to turn into seed-bearing plants. As I said, that's done through an artificial and highly mutagenic disruptive procedure. So from the standpoint of computer science, the process of producing new agricultural plants by utilizing these new so-called gene editing techniques is, in its entirety, imprecise and inherently risk-laden, and the plants must be rigorously tested. Thus, if we cut through the promotional propaganda that's been passed off as science, and we carefully examine genetic engineering in the light of our best scientific knowledge accrued both from biological science and from computer science, it becomes clear that the venture is incurably risky and that the risks are unacceptable, especially when safe, sustainable, and well-proven alternatives are readily available. Thank you very much.
Hi folks, I'm Pat Battle. I'm the director of Living Lab Farms, a local nonprofit research and education farm. I'm thrilled to have Stephen here. His book I encourage everybody to read it. It's comprehensive, it's thoroughly documented. There are 80 pages of footnotes. It's a powerful and important book. And I also have to confess that I sent it to people like my brother and loaned it to other people, and they got a little bit into it and said they couldn't handle it. It was too overwhelming. It was too depressing. And I understand that. Largely, we have come to a time in our lives where unless we eat only organic food, and good luck doing that at restaurants, we cannot avoid eating genetically engineered food. And that's pretty depressing to people like myself and many other people who are not comfortable with that. And so, what do we do about that? Well, actually, a lot is happening. And it's happening all over the world. And I was hoping Stephen would have time to get to a really important part of his book, but since he didn't get to, I get to. And that's where he talks about a massive study done by 4 UN agencies and the World Bank, not your most radical organization. 400 experts took part in it, 80-some from 80-some countries, 58-some countries endorsed it. And this was a study that looked at the impact of genetically engineered food on the future of food security, the technology of genetically engineered food. And when they were reporting this study, reporters asked, so does this prove that we need to have genetically engineered seeds in order to meet the food needs of an ever-expanding population? And the director of it, was that it? The director, in a word, said no.
I was planning on getting to that in Q&A. I figured it would come up. That's good you mentioned it.
Well, to me it's real important because it leads to what our solutions are here. What they did come up with is that what we need is for farmers to have the information they need to be empowered to use the techniques that they need to produce food and be able to sustain themselves. And that furthermore, we need to be moving agriculture away from the industrial model to more sustainable, more environmentally sustainable and socially just modes of production. And that has really taken hold in Asheville. I mean, I'm here to speak to the stuff that's not depressing to try and, I tell people when they say they can't read the book, I say, get to the back. The good news is in the back, right? But we have totally taken that on in Asheville. And we didn't take it on as a response to genetically engineered food. Asheville is a center for local food production, for sustainable food production. It's been an ever-growing center, and it has become more and more powerful because of a powerful movement of self-education. And this, if you look at social movements in history, this is always how they become powerful. One of the most powerful movements in American history was the populist movement of the late 1800s. It led to the total framework for what became the New Deal. Much of what we see as the modern social safety net happened because of the populist movement, and why the populist movement became so strong was because of incredible education, lecture circuits. It was easier then. There wasn't TV, there wasn't movies, there wasn't video games, so if a speaker came to town, everybody listened. But it was through that people got the information they need. And in Asheville has developed an incredible infrastructure of educational organizations. We have Carolina Farm Stewardship Association, which has been around since the early 1980s. We have the Organic Growers School, which has the largest educational event in the Southeast, and it's been around since the mid-90s. I've been fortunate to be involved with both of those. We have newer things like Firefly, which looks at primitive skills and how primitive skills can help people to find food. We even have one of the only, if not the only, foraging tour company in the world. Alan Muscat just got himself on the front page of the paper, teaching people how to forage for food. We have an extension service that's actually learned to meet the needs of sustainable and organic growers. We have Earth Haven, a community that's dedicated to education, that's created powerful permaculture educational systems. We have a huge array of educational institutions, and that is what we need to create the sustainable future, the answer to feeding the world in a way that actually will not break nature, that will work with nature. And this educational system has resulted in more and more young people being empowered to farm. The number of farms in this area is incredible. They're all very small. To an ever-increasing number of farmers markets, I almost think that there could be a competition between how many farmers markets there are and how many breweries. I think the breweries would still win. But if we had new farm-to-table restaurants and children's gardens at schools, I think we'd actually have more of those things occurring than breweries. And that's because of education, because of dedication. It's not like this everywhere, by the way. It will be hopefully someday. And it's actually is happening in other places. There's another book that I want to recommend to people called The Tropic of Chaos, about the impact of global warming on countries around the equator. They're being affected by the most. And there's several hopeful examples of things that are similar to what's happening in Asheville, happening around the world. There are places in Brazil where they're combining permaculture with animal integrated agriculture and creating systems that are getting high quality organic vegetables to cities, providing much better incomes and livelihoods for farmers. There are places in Africa where they've incorporated similar systems, and the results are greatly increased yields and incredibly increased water tables. So this kind of sustainable, working with the dynamism of nature farming is having a positive effect everywhere. And indeed, here in this area, a farmer who was inspired by Gabe Brown, who Living Web brought this year, you can see his video, brought to the Organic Growers School, with the Organic Growers School to this area this year. You can see his videos on our website. Russell Hedrick was inspired to move away from conventional agriculture, move to animal integrated, no-till farming using multi-species of cover crops. And using that system, he used no herbicides, right? And we're told all the time that big farmers have to use herbicides in order to be competitive and be able to produce. Well, Russell broke the records. I didn't remember to write down I think he just came in second for soybeans. But for dry corn, he broke the record using no herbicides and 60% less fertilizer because he used multi-species, and he got 309 bushels to the acre, by the way, of dry corn, using no herbicides, using instead rolled over cover crops, which suppressed the weeds well enough that he needed no herbicides, and got that kind of production. He basically is showing us a new way forward. We're told all the time that large-scale agriculture has to rely, in order to be competitive, on things like Roundup. That we have to have BT corn and BT cotton because we otherwise have to use terrible pesticides to control insects. And yet, I have worked with my entomologist friend, Dr. Richard McDonald, and have been able to show people over and over again that creating incredible diversity will give you the control you need for the great bulk of insects. And that for the ones that we cannot control that way, there are targeted pesticides that are organically allowed, including BT, which we spray on the outside, only hits the targeted pests, unlike corn and cotton that has it bred into it, and it literally is exuding that toxin into the soil. And so local farms all the time are accomplishing that. They are all over the place in markets. Their product is in all of our restaurants. We're one of the incredible food cities of the Southeast, and that happened because of the inspiration of local food. Without that availability of the inspiration of local food, it wouldn't happen. And so that has created the recreation of an infrastructure which all of America has lost. And I first experienced this and understood how powerful it was when I went to get the manure from a local stocker cattle raiser. He used to be a dairy farmer. I could walk into his farm and see massive stainless steel that he can no longer use because centralized production of dairy products put him out of business. And he said to me, Pat, if they would have just given us the difference that they spent on transporting the milk from Wisconsin to here, we could have stayed in business. But instead he had to allow himself to be bought out, and we lost our local dairy industry. Now it's coming back. Now there's places like the Mills River Creamery which are using non-GMO milk, non-GMO grain to make local milk. We're getting back our dairies. We're getting back humane small animal slaughter facilities. I worked with a group that helped to create in the Marion area a small animal slaughter facility that cared about humane slaughter. We have now 10 bait companies, we have artisan butcheries, we have local seed production, our local seed companies, So True Seed, school gardens, we have food policy councils. All of those things have occurred because of a grassroots movement that was heavily inspired by local education to create a local sustainable food system. And that is our response to the statement that we cannot feed the world without genetically modified foods.
So one question is, how does GMO feed affect the meat and our health? Well, actually, there's an interesting statement from that made by the director of the FDA Center for Veterinary Medicine. He made that in a memo that he wrote that he submitted to the FDA Biotechnology Coordinator on behalf of him and all of the other scientists at CVM, and that's a lot of scientists. And he stated that we scientists here regard the issue of feeding genetically engineered crops to animals as posing unique animal and human food safety concerns. And he stated that CVM actually wanted to conduct their own tests on that, which they didn't end up being able to do. And he stated that there could be residues of unintended substances that build up in the tissue of the animal or in the milk or in the eggs that could create a problem for the ultimate human consumer. So I'll leave it at that. And other scientists also have recognized that that could be a potential problem. Do you foresee any kind of genetically engineered foods being sustainable in the near future? Not if the facts get out. As the colloquium that I've been invited to deliver at North Carolina State University on Tuesday by people who have my book, by the way, it's titled Genetic Engineering and the Chronic Misrepresentation of Facts, the biggest but most overlooked issue in bioethics. And a point I will be making in that colloquium, which is driven home in the book, at the end of the book, is that the genetic engineering food venture is ethically unsustainable because it cannot coexist with the open, honest dissemination of facts. Okay? The truth has been systematically twisted. That can be easily documented. It has been documented, and hundreds of pages of that documentation. So if the facts get out, as I began this lecture, if enough people learn the facts, and if there's some key people, this whole thing is going to collapse. What evidence have you seen that links GMOs and cancer? Some of these studies that are troubling have shown that things could be precursors of cancer, but carcinogenicity studies, are more difficult to do. To my knowledge, most of the studies that have actually gone on to use the whole food, rather than just arguments of substantial equivalence, have been toxicological feeding studies. Those aren't conducted in the same way to the same standards of cancer, of studies that are looking for cancer links. So there have been some troubling signs that certainly warrant more studies. But to my knowledge, there's been no definitive link between a particular genetically engineered food and cancer. However, it must be said that, as most of you probably know, the most prevalent form of genetically engineered foods on the market have been engineered to tolerate an herbicide whose active ingredient is glyphosate. And recently, a few distinguished scientific bodies have concluded, based on reviewing the extensive evidence, that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. Now, other scientists have come back saying they don't agree, they don't interpret the data that way. So there's some dispute going back and forth. But again, just the fact that there's a dispute should raise some concern. And also, though, glyphosate has been shown in a solid toxicological study to be toxic to the rats that ate it. So we do know it's toxic. So whether or not it's carcinogenic is really almost beside the point, because there's strong evidence that it has been shown to be toxic. Have you found a more accepting reception to your message from foreign countries than from US? If so, why? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It really depends on the audience. Many audiences in this country have been very receptive. And, I gave a seminar, I was invited to give a seminar at Columbia University. That seemed to have been pretty well received. one of the professors who attended that seminar then read my book and then invited me to Columbia again to give a lecture to her class. So people who read the book seem to have different opinions than opinionated people who talk about the book who haven't read it. How to put the genie back in the bottle? Well, again, it's uncorking the suppressed evidence. If we let the evidence out of the bottle, the suppressed evidence, if we shine a light on the extensive misrepresentations, if people realize the extent to which they've been hoodwinked, and most scientists in this country and the world who have formed opinions about genetically engineered foods have, to a significant extent, formed them based on misinformation. So if we can get the truth out of the bottle, then this GMO genie goes back into the bottle. Isn't it true that concerning unintended side effects in testing, it sometimes takes a number of years for these side effects to appear, thus complicating accurate responses and regulations? Well, certainly, to do the extensive tests that should be done, if we want to have the testing of GMOs commensurate with the rigorous testing that is done in the field of computer science, or even if we disregard computer science and do the kinds of testing that many eminent biologists have called for, then there would have to be multi-generational testing as well. That takes a longer time. So doing long-term tests is very important, but very few genetically engineered foods have ever been subjected to meaningful long-term safety testing employing the whole food. So most of the testing has been short-term or medium-term. So yes, much longer testing, much more rigorous testing is needed. When I go to the grocery store, how do I know what isn't genetically modified and what is? It's challenging in the United States and in Canada. Basically, what you need to do is download some of these guides as to the major foods that are and are not genetically engineered. And the Organic Consumers Association is a good guide, the Center for Food Safety. I think you can look for True Food Guide, I believe. There are shopping guides that are put out by Institute for Responsible Technology, and things change, so you have to keep checking it out. But generally, the main genetically engineered crops to date are corn, soy, canola, cotton. That can be an issue because a generic vegetable oil may have cottonseed oil in it. Sugar beets, Hawaiian papayas, probably some papayas from other countries by now too. Alfalfa is increasingly becoming genetically engineered. That's a problem for organic dairy farmers because they use that as a feed. Anybody else want to throw in one? There's now an apple out in the market. There's now a potato again on the market.
Smart potato.
But so those foods, you have to be reading labels carefully. If something says it has corn or soy or an ingredient from canola and it doesn't say it's certified organic, that particular ingredient, then the odds are it's genetically engineered. The best thing to look for is certified USDA organic for that particular ingredient, but also to see non-GMO project verified, because a product could be certified organic and still over the years there could have been accumulation of contamination from GMO crops that cross-pollinated. And there's not a requirement that organic crops get tested to see if there was GMO contamination. So it's a lot safer to buy an organic product, but if you have a concern, the gold standard is both certified organic and non-GMO product verified. Can you discuss the safety of biologics that contain animal DNA, such as, I can't read this word, prescribed to, I think this must be some drug prescribed to prevent some disease. I really can't discuss the safety of that. I haven't studied it. There's a whole different level of risk analysis when we get to pharmaceuticals compared to foods. And very simply, according to U.S. food safety law, it's actually illegal to try to factor in risks, potential benefits. Trying to do a risk-benefit balancing when it comes to the safety of a food additive is actually illegal. Most people don't know that in the U.S. Now, it's not the case with a pharmaceutical. There you know there are going to be risks. There are going to be side effects. So one has to do an intelligent balancing of the potential side effects versus the benefit that will be accrued. And, those are not easy to do, or they shouldn't be easy to do. Please address the connection between GMO foods and social justice. I think Patrick just did that. You can go to the table of his organization and go into that more, because I focus much more on the food safety, environmental issues. So I'm going to thank you again for your attention, and if anybody wants a signed book, I'll be happy to accommodate that desire.